The synod that we held in 2014 put formation on the agenda. To make this happen, we've revitalized the Institute, done the upgrade, and the Institute has two main focus. The first is to have conversations like this of public interest, to get again at issues at hand and to think them through from a perspective, the perspective of the Catholic social teaching, of the Bible, of the Christian tradition. The second part of the Institute is to offer formation for all of our people through face-to-face learning, through distance learning with Dayton University, and through other means that we will use with technology to inspire people to learn more about their faith and to learn more about what it is to be a good citizen of this country. So the Institute really is to get people thinking, get people speaking, get people acting, and involving people in the transformation of church and society. And so it is a great honor for me today to formally launch the Catholic Formation Institute and to say that we are now well underway in moving the church to its next stage. The topic that we have today of sparing the rod and spoiling the child, and I'm sure that there are many people who will argue blue in the face that this is a biblical mandate. Well, I will challenge you to find it in the Bible, because it doesn't exist. It is actually a poem from the 1600s that is echoing a poem from the 1300s that is kind of doing a redaction or a form of commentary on a verse from Proverbs 13:24. So the actual verse of Proverbs says, and this is the New International Version, whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. The verse of the poem says, love is a boy, by poet styled, then spared the rod and spoiled the child. And that was by Butler, and it was a satirical poem. It was a poem meant to poke fun at society and poke fun at conventions and poke fun at what is happening. So if we step back now and ask, okay, we're in a brave new 21st century, and what does it mean for us today? And I would like to try and separate two things. One is the how, and the second is the what. I think the how is what we need to have great conversations around. I'm hoping that we all agree to the what. The what that is underlying the biblical verse and the poem is about discipline. How we administer discipline might be what we will have conversations around. But just to say that throughout the whole of the Old and New Testament, that the notion of discipline is a very central notion. And it comes in many different ways. In the book of Hebrews 12:6-7, the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a child. And so in the New Testament, the notion of discipline is still central. Why is it so central? Because if we don't help children to have a sacred no, a boundary that cannot be violated, a boundary where they know that you cross that boundary and you are into waters that are murky, into waters that are troublesome. If a child doesn't get that from very young and a clear sense of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, then you're going to spoil the child. And we've seen many civilizations take the text and go with it in different ways. So I know in England and America, if a parent only spanks a child even lightly and even once, they could get into legal trouble for that. I know Caribbean families in England had serious trouble with this, because unfortunately in the toolkit of discipline, there's only one tool, the rod, or the belt, or the hand, or the slap, or the spank. And because the toolkit is populated with only one tool, when it comes to discipline, if you take that tool away, it seems as if you've tied the parents' hands behind their back and they can't do anything more. But the toolkit of discipline has to be far more nuanced and far more populated, just like a carpenter's toolkit that has a nail, a screwdriver, a hammer, a pliers, all kinds of different things. But you know, to the man who has a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. The principle of Catholic social teaching that is being highlighted here is the dignity of the child, or the dignity of the human person. And we have nearly thought irrationally that you only get dignity when you become an adult. As long as you live in my house, you could do as I say. In other words, you have no rights, you have no conversation, you have no thoughts, you have no nothing for yourself. But dignity begins at the moment of natural conception and ends only at the moment of natural death. So what does dignity of the child require of us while we understand and commit ourselves to disciplining children and disciplining adults, I would dare say, because some of them are in more need of discipline than the children themselves. I often say that God never made a bad child. We have bad parents, bad parenting, bad societies. Bad children, no. There are some children who have a mental deformity that they can't distinguish between right and wrong. That's a mental illness. That's not bad, because it's not a choice. So to understand dignity means that we have to be able to get a discipline while holding the dignity of that child as sacred. And that means that the discipline can't simply be a tirade, verbal or physical, on the child. The other part of it is that the more verbal and physical you go with a child in discipline from young, the less likely they are to respond to it as they grow older. They become more and more immune. And now you have to up the ante constantly. So if we separate the how from the what, and we agree to discipline as being the non-negotiable, then the how we do the discipline becomes a real question. And here I am proposing that we can start thinking of a toolkit and start thinking of what tools might be in that kit that we would use for discipline. The level of violence that passes off as discipline in Caribbean society for me is alarming. And I mean, I've seen what I would consider physical and verbal abuse being used for what is being considered by the parent discipline. And that could only perpetuate violence in the society, and negative reactions, and deep, deep hurt, and deep, deep anger in society. And I often have wondered, not just in how we discipline, but how we relate, and the deep negativity we have with each other in our relationships, the way we bring down each other in the family, the way the pastime in the family so often is focusing on what is negative in the child and in each other. Whether this is not a deep anxiety from our ancestral past, from a plantation system, from slavery, from the unhealed wounds of our ancestors. And that might be something that might also come up in the conversation. The Holy Father got himself into some interesting debate not too long ago, when he himself jumped into the reference of child disciplining. He referred to a father who had said, I sometimes have to smack my children a bit, but never in the face so as to not humiliate them. He then praised the father not for smacking his kids, but for respecting their dignity by not hitting them in the face or humiliating them. He knows the sense of dignity, the Pope says. He has to punish them, but does not justify, and then he moves on quickly. Well, the American and the European media went crazy. But the Pope is from Argentina, where smacking a child is a normal thing, and where he is actually moving from what would be commonplace, like in Barbados, I suppose, where smacking a child in public would not even be frowned upon by anybody, and even in excess. And he's at least praising that we must modify the way that we do discipline, and whatever we do, we must hold the dignity of that person as sacred, and we must never do anything in discipline that would undo the dignity of that person. Spare the rod and spoil the child, well, it's not biblical. So we could put that aside. But there are enough biblical quotes to help us to see that there's something here that we must speak about. Once, not too long ago, a mother came to me with her son who the principal of the school, a Catholic school, said he could not graduate for something he did, begging me to overturn the principal's mandate. I listened to her carefully, and then I said to her, "Madam, let me tell you something. Does this boy have a father active in his life?" She said, "No." I said, "So this father figure that he's meeting, that has said to him no, you want me to make this father impotent in this boy's eyes?" Or how? The next father he might meet might be a policeman. The one after that might be a judge, and the one after that might be a jailer. I want this boy to know that when a father says no, it means no, and he can't get around it. We sometimes act in two different and opposite ways. We try to get our children out of the trouble that they themselves have got themselves into without letting them take the consequences of discipline. And part of the problem we have is that the parents have been the ones who have enabled the children to not face the discipline of the adults in society and the caregivers, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the parents themselves have been fairly violent in the way that they administer discipline. And so we really have a bipolar situation here. I'm sure the panel will speak to some of this. So I would like to end my comments by saying that discipline is central to the Christian tradition, but human dignity is central to the Christian tradition. This is a paradox that we must hold. We must hold discipline, we must hold human dignity. And in between that, we need to find the best way how. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, good night. I'm Deanne, and I will start with a definition from the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. And they define corporal punishment, and you might have your own definition, so see if it's in here. Any punishment which is given with physical force to cause some degree of pain or discomfort, however light. Most involves hitting, smacking, slapping, spanking children with the hand or with an implement. Could be a whip, stick, belt, shoe, wooden spoon, anything you can put your hand on. But it can also involve, for example, kicking, shaking or throwing children, scratching, pinching, biting, pulling hair or boxing ears, forcing children to stay in uncomfortable positions, burning, scalding, or forced ingestion. For example, washing children's mouths out with soap or forcing them to swallow hot spices. In the view of the committee, corporal punishment is invariably degrading. In addition, there are other non-physical forms of punishment which are also cruel and degrading, and thus is described by the Convention on the Rights of the Child as punishment which belittles, humiliates, denigrates, scapegoats, threatens, scares, or ridicules the child. The committee believes that protection against corporal punishment is a human rights issue. In the Barbadian context, 14 years ago, 70% of Barbadians felt that it was their right to administer corporal punishment, both in schools and in homes. If Peter was here, he would give you more figures, but I will steal something from his report. In 2009, the good news is that we discovered that that has dropped from 70% as it was to something like 50%. The Barbadian population is beginning to see the light, I hope. However, across the country, across the region, not country, the deputy principal of the Open Campus did a research on violence against children. And she found that the widespread support and use of corporal punishment is purported to be a result of a complex interplay of cultural and social norms that we all grew up with. And these include the belief that children are born bad or wicked and need correcting, the view that children are property of their parents, the widespread belief that physical punishment is a necessary part of character building, the lack of knowledge to non-violent discipline approaches, and the importance placed on children being obedient and showing respect. And the other thing, of course, was that the Bible said that we had to spare the rod and spoil the child. And I tell you, as far as the Bishop said, the Bible didn't say that. And the part that we refer to also says, train up your child in the way that they should go. And if we haven't done the training, well, why are we using the rod? Because we are the ones at fault. On the contrary, however, people think that there are no non-violent ways, but there are, and before the end of the night I will share some with you. But I want to bring to you some of the psychological impact that corporal punishment might have on your child. Some of the research findings is suggesting that corporal punishment may lead to adverse child outcomes. And some of these adverse child outcomes will include disruptive and antisocial behavior, poor academic achievement, poor attachment to either mother, father, or family as a whole, lack of parent and child warmth, mental health problems, particularly internalizing problems such as bipolar disorder and depression, substance abuse, and alcohol abuse. So the psychological impact is there. And before the night is out, I trust that from your questions and my information, we will come up, I will be able to give you some non-violent ways of dealing with children. Thank you.
Good evening to everyone. Let me first locate the whole matter of sparing this rod and spoiling the child, where it was presumably came from. And that is why people object when you speak of banning corporal punishment. The frequent reply is that that was the biblical direction for the training and the disciplining of children. So that I always feel it necessary to go back to the first principles to discover why we feel that this is what we were told to do. And we know that, well, Barbados is still considered a very Christian country. Most people here adhere to some Christian principles. And therefore it's important for them to understand that what we're speaking of tonight does not necessarily have its basis in any particular direction from the Bible. The concern I had for much of my career was wondering whether rod in the passage used in Proverbs was the rod as we know it. And therefore, I didn't trust my own judgment on this. I sought a brief tutorial from the head of my own church, who is also a Hebrew scholar and an Old Testament scholar. And I posed the question as to whether that was a true translation, because it was very puzzling to me how we could get so many different meanings for the word rod. And he pointed out to me that it really was, the Hebrew word was shevet or shebat. And that word actually could be translated to mean rod, staff, authority, scepter, tribe, root. There were many meanings. And which meant that it did not necessarily mean that in the passage that we all refer to loosely to mean discipline. In fact, my concern always has been And it was pointed out to me that I legitimately could have the concern, is that how could the same word be used in what is my favorite passage in the Bible, thy rod and thy staff shall comfort me, and also mean a punitive instrument. So that there is, of course, a lot of academic discussion on this point, but I felt secure in my view that we have been translating much of Proverbs incorrectly. And in fact, what it is saying is you must discipline your child. And if you don't discipline your child, or if you don't show your authority, then you will spoil the child. The child will not be brought up in the right right way. So that what we accept is that they must be disciplined, and that's really the direction that we're being given. The other phrase, the other quotations often used to me, which completely upsets me, is that folly shall be bound up in a child and the rod shall drive it out. Well, that one really, really gets me going, because my view is that if that is the case, we should be applying the rod to many adults who I feel are far greater bound up in folly than a lot of children. And since the 1990s, we have outlawed beating adults. The law says you can't beat an adult, so therefore we should not be beating children. But let me get back to another point that was mentioned earlier, and that is that one of the points often raised by persons when you discuss banning corporal punishment in Barbados is that look at those countries that have done it and look at the upsurge in criminal activity. Not that they have ever been able to prove a direct correlation. I want to point out that, first of all, they all focus on the United States, and I must tell you that this is incorrect in that the United States actually has not banned corporal punishment across the board. 19 states, generally in the South and West, still retain it in both public and private schools. And interestingly, when one looks at the map, 14 of those states were slave-holding states in the 19th century. And I think that that is not just a coincidence. And I think this is where we are also coming from in this part of the world. On the other side, I may say that while 100 countries around the world have banned corporal punishment in schools, and 42 other countries have banned it in the home as well, there are 48 countries who are in the process of reform and that moving towards banning corporal punishment. And I pray, and I'm in an appropriate place, I think, for praying, that Barbados can be classified in the number of the reform group, because I've made recommendations, and let me clarify those recommendations. I have recommended that we move towards, listen carefully to my words, that we evolve into one of those countries that have banned corporal punishment, because I understand it cannot be done overnight. There is a lot of positive parenting that has got to be taught. Exactly. There have been alternatives that have got to be understood and inculcated before we can completely ban corporal punishment, but we must be moving towards it. And let me say then, in that context, that I look towards an example of best practice, and Sweden was the first country to ban corporal punishment, and they did this in 1979. And not only is physical punishment banned in the home and school, but they also included mentally humiliating treatment. For example, the ridiculing, the frightening, the threatening, and the shutting a child up in a room. However, in Sweden, banning corporal punishment was a slow and gradual process, and it actually started the process in the 1920s. And they started by introducing it in the antenatal clinics. They made sure that mothers-to-be understood that corporal punishment was bad and what you can do instead. Then it is also, the whole doctrine is then preached again in the maternity wards. And one of the interesting things about how they approach it, they have not necessarily made it a crime, but they make it a reason for intervention. So that if a parent was found to be using corporal punishment, persons went in to intervene, social workers went in to intervene to teach those persons how to do it well. So I think that that evolutionary method is the way it is done, and it is the way that we ought to follow, because that is, I think, the only way that you can change a culture, and ours is a culture. Let me say finally that my passion about getting rid of corporal punishment, if not in my lifetime, certainly in the very near future, is that it's based on my experience presiding over the juvenile court, and because we have to locate this thing within our own experience sometimes. And I dealt with 274 cases were all juveniles who would be deemed delinquent, who had appeared before the court. They were in conflict with the law. And one of the things that all 274 cases had in common is they'd all been beaten. They'd all suffered corporal punishment in varying degrees, some very, very severely. And I want to address that about severe corporal punishment. And one of the things that I noted was that this was a residual scar on the minds of all those children when they went, because of course in the juvenile court we do not sentence any child unless they've had psychological testing and evaluation, thank you. And when the report emerges, always the beating was a significant factor in what the child said. Another significant factor too was the fact that a father was not present, but that's for another conversation. And the sad part of this was that despite all the beating, that child still ended up before the court. It had not taught the child anything. And very often the child could not really have been taught anything because it was found that the child had been suffering certain mental deficits, such as ADHD. A lot of children get beaten because they're ADHD, a condition that they cannot help. This is why I feel that somehow it does not seem to answer the case. I also feel that the violence seemed to breed violence. Many of them, having been beaten, took that same message onto the school bus. They took it into the playground. They took it into the classroom, because the language they had learned was, if you want to get something done the way you want it done, violence is the answer. I will just close by saying that the whole question of corporal punishment must certainly be debated, but we must come down on the side of banning it, because I think it's an abuse of authority against little people.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. The gun appears to be loaded. I'm pointed at principals. Good evening, nevertheless. Discipline is vital for civilized society, and I'm sure that all of you agree with that, and the school is no different. This evening, as I was coming here, one of the persons here indicated how the minibus people operated. They would either duck through here or ease around, go in the right lane and then go in the left and ease around, etc. And that's an example of indiscipline. You can see what can happen. However, we must remember that schools are not prison camps. Schools actually are homes away from home for the students. The students spend a significant amount of their time at schools. And teachers are considered not jailers, but in loco parentis, that is, parents. I met a young lady who congratulated me on being the principal of her alma mater and indicated that those were the best years that she ever spent in her life when she's looking back. I don't know if she was flogged or not, but that's the sort of experience that tends to happen. The regulations with respect to corporal punishment, which seem to be the nucleus of the nuclei of this, that is carried out in a regulated manner. And it is only purview of the principal, and the principal can designate to certain persons, but only certain persons for certain transgressions. So it's not winning anything in the secondary school, and I'm sure in the primary school. We actually have a range of options, and it may amaze you, if not surprised, to learn that the ones that are most often used are warnings and attempts at moral suasion and getting people to apologize. Those more overwhelmingly are the ones that are constantly used as we attempt to mold the students in the direction we know they should go. And of course, I expect that's what you do at home too. Parental interventions, that works up to a point, but it really is dependent on the type of individual that presents themselves as a parent. The definition of a parent could be, I happen to get together and we produce something, and that's a parent. But really and truly, when we think of parent, it is far more than that. I've been presented with parents who, quite frankly, were more of a hindrance than a help, and I realized that I had then we had a lot on our plate because we aren't going to get the support of those parents. Not that they were not willing, but they were not able, and they couldn't really, they were not skilled enough to be able to bring about the changes at home that we expected. And some would declare that and say, well, really and truly, you got to help me, you got to do something with this boy, and you got to do something with this girl, because you're making me snort at home and leave it on my desk, on our desk. So you get situations like that. Community service is something we also that are also included. Just today, there were a number of transgressors who came to my fore, and I know there was an area of the foundation pastor that was lively with cups and saucers and so on, and we indicated to them what they will have to do as a result. And unlike another situation I don't care to mention, they complied. I must say it was a little charging because I did not expect them to be as vigorous in as they complied. I thought it was a big punishment, but the grins I saw on their faces, I had to think again, maybe I need to do something else. Suspensions, internal, that could be lunchtime or after school, but there again, remember that you are also suspended individual who have to sit and look after them, give up the lunch and after time. External suspension, up to 10 days we allowed as principals, and after that we can get 10 more as a result of an okay from the Board of Management if you think that's the case. And of course the ultimate is expulsion. So there are, and normally when there's expulsion, it's at the Nichols Center. The Nichols Center is an institute that has relatively recently been put together, where these persons go around and remain in the community, and there's a one-on-one, there is an interaction there with small groups with a variety of personnel who assess them, appraise them, and we get a report, and we very much depend on that report as a guide. Recently instituted is an institution called New Horizons, where those persons who have been assessed as having serious issues are sent, and they have a special interaction there. I'm saying that to say that there are a wide variety of tools in the toolkit, not just one, and which tool you use is often determined by many factors. The person, when they appear before you, much as in the courts, and guilt has been established, what is the most appropriate tool to use? A, to punish so they know for sure what they have done is inappropriate and will meet with certain consequences, but just as importantly, how are we going to rehabilitate you so you don't do it again? And trying to determine what's the most appropriate solution, you have to take into account the student you're dealing with. Have they done this repeatedly? I normally use the term, a court term, is he known to the court? And by that I asked the fellow, is he known to the court means that he come up for these charges before, and what did we do last time? And let's see what is happening this time. in addition to that, I have to decide which of these is going to be most appropriate. Now, those are some of the ways we look at discipline. I notice here they want me just to mention something about violence on the school premises. Violence on the school premises is dependent on the severity of the violence on a number of areas. The level of severity, were weapons used or not, were the persons injured or not, and were the possessions destroyed. All of these are taken into account before you determine what is appropriate. And of course, if it's weapons and if it's severe, then our first dispensation is to make sure those who have been injured are well looked after, to make sure, and of course parents are involved, and then afterwards we look to, if it's weapons involved, to bring in the police. These days, more and more parents are want to go to the police themselves before they even get to me. They had gone down and they laid the charge, well, not laid the charge, but indicated what had happened. And then they come back up and probably tell me, well, I've been to the police. Sometimes I feel like, they've been to the police, you don't need me, because the police can sort you out. But nevertheless, I know I have to continue, because the police will come back and ask me some questions. The police tend not to like to put a heavy situation on young lives. It may amaze you to know that a lot of persons that I have looked back on the records and I saw were kind of left of center in the way they behaved, go on to become policemen and people in the army, etc. So you have to be very careful when you bring your laying charges, etc. With respect to that. So it's a fluid thing. The ministry had produced a code of discipline which they took the essence out of what principals do and gave a code as a guideline. But at the end of the day, when you are there having to make the decision, you really have to go by what is happening. And once again, I end by saying, note that I mentioned several other options that are used and available, a part of which corporal punishment is only one. Thank you.
The church is a critical institution. It is not so much a church, but a religious perspective that is believed to be at the root of why so many people use corporal punishment. So the church has to be actively involved in any effort to curtail it. So I'm certainly happy, and I was willing to respond to the invitation that was offered to be part of this exercise and to share with you some information that UNICEF has collected over the past 10 years. 10 years ago, the UNICEF had a session where they invited children, and they did an informal survey asking children how they felt about corporal punishment. And it was at that point that I got involved with them, and we have monitored public opinion on the issue since then. We've asked people questions like, do they use corporal punishment? How do they feel about corporal punishment and generally? And I've had the good fortune to track the issue between 2004 and 2016, either through UNICEF surveys or surveys that were conducted nationally. And the data set is very interesting. Barbados has generally a level of support for corporal punishment that is somewhere around 50%, which means half of us support it. And this is just generally because there's corporal punishment in the home and school, and those who oppose it are around 35%. And that is, as I said, just the general support for corporal punishment. But what we have found, however, is that people seem to support it generally. However, they are uncomfortable with the idea of other people beating their children. So we found that there is a serious slippage in relation to supporting the schools, and we are at a situation now in Barbados where supporting the schools has moved from a majority of people supporting it to the point now where you have equal levels of supportive opposition, and there's a general downward trend, suggested that in another few years, or perhaps even now, already you will find a minority of Barbadians supporting corporal punishment in schools. But there still is a belief that there's a role for it in the home. Of course, support in the home is somewhat higher. The other fascinating thing about this data, and this was a point I made when we did the session last week, is that I find that the correlations are fascinating. So women are more supportive of corporal punishment than men. which doesn't surprise me because women are the people who have to do a lot of the raising and rearing in the home. Younger people are less supportive than older people. Generally, older people are more supportive of corporal punishment. Teachers tend to support corporal punishment more than people who do not teach. The Barbados Union of Teachers was involved at some stage with one of the surveys, and we discovered that teachers were more supportive of corporal punishment. And I'll say a little bit about that shortly. Educational achievement. We found that persons who were more educated were less inclined to support corporal punishment. People who were less educated were less inclined to support corporal punishment. And then, of course, the racial factor, black people. We seem to prefer to beat our children more than people who are not black. Now, of course, this is a delicate and somewhat challenging issue to explore scientifically because we don't have equal numbers. But what we have found is that invariably whenever we interviewed white people and we asked them about beating their children, they would always be opposed to it. However, we found that there was a certain preoccupation among persons of my color towards corporal punishment. And I find it fascinating. Just the final point I wanted to make, though, about the schools, and where I mentioned the reality that teachers tend to support it. We have a situation in Barbados where corporal punishment is directly assumed to be related to discipline. So many people believe that unless you are going to beat someone, you can't discipline them. When we had the session last week, there were some young children that spoke, and I got the distinct impression that one of them was saying to me, until you know and understand the experience of a working class kid, you will not know and understand why flogging is important. And I thought that that was a particularly upsetting and disturbing comment to come from a child who claimed to be from that socioeconomic background. But more importantly, because I understand from the work I did with the Barbados Union of Teachers, that in many instances, the reason that teachers support corporal punishment is because they believe it is the only way they can maintain discipline in certain schools among certain socioeconomic groups. This brings me to this whole question that, again, I find disturbing, that there are particular types of children that do not respond unless you beat them. We have a problem in Barbados where we have created educational ghettos, and I say that without fear or reservation. It is something that successive governments have done. We have created educational ghettos, and then we have given them to people like Robert to manage. Now, he doesn't manage one because foundation is in class by itself. I just had to stick that in. But let's say were he fortunate or unfortunate enough to be awarded one of these schools, and then he has to maintain discipline in an environment where he's dealing with children who think like the young lady that spoke last week, and who will say, the only way you are going to get these kids to understand is if you beat them. It's scary, because this is the problem that the challenge that we are dealing with. If you create an educational institution and an environment in which you have a cluster of children who are from a similar socioeconomic group and have similar educational challenges, and then you say to a teacher, you need to go into that environment and teach and maintain discipline and order, the teacher is invariably going to say, well, I can't do that unless I beat people. Because the methods that work at some of the higher achieving schools are not going to work at these schools because these kids don't understand that language. And it's language I've heard before, because I actually went to primary school where there was a preponderance of children from a lower socioeconomic group. And this was a conversation that took place among teachers all the time. Well, you know, if you don't beat these, they will never understand. And it was really compelling. The last conversation I had of this type with a panel like this that was done by the Anglican Church, and they did a panel and they also invited me to make a contribution. And there was a lady who came from the United Kingdom, and she was a teacher. And she said, I taught at a primary school in the United Kingdom, and I came, and my first assignment was at St. Winifred's. And I know that in St. Winifred's, sorry, let me go the other way around. I came from the United Kingdom where people do not use corporal punishment. And I went to a government-owned public primary school. And I was immediately told by the teachers, forget all that you learned in the United Kingdom about not beating children. If you don't beat these, they will never hear to you. So you have to beat them. And she said she did as she was told. She came in, she took the strap, and she shared lashes. Eventually, she was moved from that school to St. Winifred's. And she said that when she got to St. Winifred's, the Board of Management told her, these girls consider themselves princesses. You don't beat princesses. And she said it was so fascinating that she was able to appeal to the princesses without beating them. But she found it unfortunate that when she went to a school with children that she thought were equal, of her own color, that looked just like her, she was told, you have to beat them to make them understand. So ladies and gentlemen, I think that this is one of the more challenging issues that you have to address when you look at this. Apart from the fact that, as I said, the church is involved, there is this social, socioeconomic, and class situation, on top of the fact that we have schools that are cauldrons of indiscipline, in which it doesn't appear as though teachers have much other choice, and as a result, may out of desperation resort to physical violence. Okay. But thank you for having me as part of the panel.